See that. Tonight, we have a lot to cover, so we'll jump right into it. It's entitled Zionist Hour. I did for a reason. It's the moment that I would say it's the peak years, the apogee of the Zionist movement. Political battle for Jewish statehood in the international arena. Last week we talked about what was going on in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, and the tensions that erupt between the Jews and the British over what I tried to explain was a non-policy, a lack of policy, which is always a problem, because if you don't know where you're going in politics, it ends up with all kinds of bad unintended consequences. Tonight we talk about the other struggle that was going on at the same time, as I see outside of Eretz Yisrael. The political battle of this brings us the very important basic idea that from then until today, Israel depends on a number of things, needs them all. They need divine help big time. They also need a strong army. And then they also need the support of people who are not Jewish around the world, key decision makers and others. The original idea of Zionism was we can move to a stage that we don't need others. It'd be a nice independent state. I wouldn't mind that. We would like that Israel should be as independent as most other countries are, that they don't hang on the approval of we're still there. So even though it's 60 some years, 65 years, we're still in the Stadlonim period, in which we need, as we all know, constant and successful lobbying all over the place with important decision makers who are not Jewish. And one way or another, we have to kind of make the case for them, because if we lose that, we're in very big trouble. So what I'm talking about tonight is not something simply that happened once upon a time, which it did, but it's also a fundamental, sort of an existential pattern for political survival of the Jews. And so I don't care, you could have the Irgun, the Haganah, that could be 10 times as big as they were. If they didn't get the support of people like Truman and others, it wouldn't happen. It's sad that it has to be like that, but all it means is it's still gullus. Right? Haven't got there yet. Right? An ideal is something you strive for, but you didn't get there yet. Having said that, so let's go into our beginning. The war ended as we all know, in September 1945. They dropped the A-bomb, then Japan surrendered, and then that's over. So now President Truman and the other world leaders, but in this case the United States I'm focusing on, turned to deal with a whole bunch of other problems now that the war's over. The Jews aren't the only problem, but they're one of them. At least he chose to view it that way. And one of the very interesting things you'll see in a second is that Truman, and I made this point before, but Ari found me the clip on the YouTube. It's Yasher Koch to him, where Truman was obviously personally very emotionally impacted by the DP situation, by the movies that he saw that we all are familiar with, the horrible movies at the end of the war with all the dead bodies and all that sort of thing. And here is that piece I mentioned actually a couple weeks ago from a TV show he did about 20 years after he was the president, or there in the 60s, let's put it that way, in which you'll see, he says, I still dream about those pictures now. And therefore, it was an emotional issue with him. All right? So Truman turns his attention to the displaced persons, the Jews in other words, well aware that public sentiment in the United States, like him, favors sending them to Palestine, not to America. They don't want to change the immigration laws, and they will not change the immigration laws while Truman is the president, not substantially, which is interesting. But to be perfectly fair about it, the U.S. Army gave the Jews a preferential treatment, if you want to know about it. The General Hildring said that under the occupation, the German was given 1,550 calories a day, the Jews get 2,200. So, because they were starving. In other words, they deserved it. But I'm just saying that you have a different and interesting attitude that's coming in there. Let's take a look at this. This is Truman talking. you see that he, brought a certain amount of emotionalism to the scene. He wrote to the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Walter George of Georgia, who was a well-known right-wing Democrat extremist, segregationist, and he said, they really should do something, the United States should do something about it. And he said to Senator George, now his name is Truman, that guy's name is George. He says, your ancestors and mine, if I remember correctly, came to this country to escape exactly these conditions. But it didn't work. Now, Truman said, I wish every member of Congress could visit the displaced person camps in Germany, in Austria, and see what is happening to 500,000 human beings through no fault of their own. But pay attention to this closely. For Truman, Palestine, the displaced persons, was basically a humanitarian issue and not a political one. He did not think in terms of a Jewish state because he and most people thought that that's prejudiced. America is a state, separation of church and state. Was epis, a Jewish state. This is an issue that Israel is battling with right now in public opinion, as you know, with the Palestinians, all the rest of it. They want to recognize the Jewish character of Israel. And it's kind of interesting because many Americans, you would think most of them, would say, what do you mean there's not a Christian state? It's not a Jewish state. It should be a non-sectarian kind of state. That kind of attitude was very politically correct in the 1940s, even more so than today. His personal Jewish friends in Missouri thought the exact same way. Truman had a number of Jewish friends. They were Reform Jews. They were Jews who were assimilated sometimes, as we'll see. Most American Jews thought that way in 1945. People didn't think about a Jewish state. You can't go backwards and say because Israel came out, so everybody was always planning for it. Zionism for most American Jews, and I remember this as a child from older people, a generation older, that they said that Zionism is a humanitarian movement. Yeah, that's the American way. If you want to know really how Zionism was sold in this country in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, it was really sold as cultural Zionism, as a humanitarian movement. If you asked even those who were interested, for the great majority, there was a few exceptions, but for the great majority, you're helping build kibbutzim, you're sending money over for Hadassah, you're helping refugees find a place to live. The politics is, I'm not a political person, it has nothing to do with that. I'm just trying to solve a human type of problem. So this is the background out of which he's coming, and that's in September of 45. In October, he wrote to the British saying, what do you think we should do about the Jewish problem, you might say, all these refugees. The British in no way want to let any Jews into Palestine. As we recall, it'll just tick off the Arabs. The white paper was still enforced, what they had put in just before the Second World War in 1939. So under those terms, 75, basically a tiny, tiny trickle was allowed in every year, 1,500 people. And yet he's putting pressure upon them. And the British said like this, well, why don't you move the displaced persons to new areas in North Africa? We can set up camps and things. That's all you need, a bunch of hilarious. So let's put it this way: Truman wasn't interested in that. He declined this. We can go to the next one. That brainstorm was from these nice fellas over here, the new heads of the British government. And that's all we need to end up in the Ivory Coast or someplace like that. But that's what they wanted. Instead, pressed Ernest Bevin, who was the foreign minister and the strong man in the British cabinet. He set up what was called the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry to investigate the tragedy of the DPs and devise a solution. So how's it go? When facing a problem, my constant advice is form a committee and stave off the crisis. And as I touched on this last week, the Americans appointed several people and the British appointed several people, and jointly they're supposed to go over there. The American delegation included some people with no sympathy whatsoever for the Jews, but they included some people with heavy sympathy for the Jews. Most famously, as I mentioned last week, Bartley Crum, who was this Republican lawyer from California, big Hollywood lawyer, and he was friendly to Jewish cause, and of course, James G. McDonald, who is a person we'll be running across. Not so many people know about him. I've talked about him from time to time. He was a great friend of the Jewish people. He wasn't Jewish, James Grover McDonald, and he had been the High Commissioner for a little while in 1933 and 34 under Roosevelt at the beginning of Hitler, and he's the guy who had the first interview with Hitler when he came to power early in 1933, when Hitler said, I'm going to teach the world how to get rid of Jews. And he had that one-on-one conversation where he looked him in the eye and said, this guy means business. And he came back and told Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin, but nobody listened to him. And so he, not only that, but he spent about a year running around from country to country, trying to find places to take in all these Jewish refugees, and of course we know nobody would take them in. And as a result, he became what you might call grounded in the Jewish issue. He was the president of the Foreign Policy Association for many years. So he was a macher among the elites, but in a very unusual way, he had tremendous sympathy for the Jews, particularly after the Holocaust, and the movement heads off. They go first to the DP camps in Germany, and I remember my father told me this, all the Jews in the DP camps have already been coached and psyched out. Rock Eretz Yisrael. Even if you're really planning to go to America or somewhere else, but you tell them, Rock Eretz Yisrael. And they do. So wherever they say, we want to go to Israel, not only that, it's not just dumb. They say, here, we'll have our own country, let's speak in Hebrew. After the psychological scarring that our children have witnessed, the only thing that can really provide an antidote is to go to Tel Aviv and see everything Jewish and all. Psychologically, it's the only way around this, not to go to another galut country, as they would call about it. They also went around in Central Europe. This is one of the best things they did. They went to Vienna and places like that and experienced personally, these are all not Jews, they experienced personally the toxic anti-Semitism which is still thriving in Europe right after the Holocaust in late 1945. The attitude in Poland and in Austria and in all of these places are, Hitler didn't do a good enough job. You understand? So they're shocked. That's a good thing. People don't know, maybe, or most people don't know, that there was raging anti-Semitism, lethal killing in Europe after the Holocaust. In the immediate years after the Holocaust. It's a very complex topic. It's one of those things, if I get off on it, I'll stay here forever. But people don't know, great wars were raging in Eastern Europe, I repeat, in Eastern Europe, between the communist forces on the one hand and the nationalist force on the other. They just kept it out of the news. In the Ukraine, in the Baltic states, and in Poland and places like this, wars are raging, except since he kept out of the news, the Russian army eventually crushed them. So these people who were against the communists were very often want to kill every Jew they could find. And so Rabbi Eliezer Silver is very famous. That's a picture of him in army uniform. He got himself immediately appointed a brigadier general because the reason is like this. He wanted to go right after the war, and he did, to visit Eastern Europe and the DP camps. He was at a Agudas Rabbanim. Some people may remember him from Cincinnati. He was one of the leading Orthodox rabbi in America. And he especially wanted to go and see if he could hook up with the yeshiva boys who survived the war, who were in different kvutzot in Prague and in the Munich and in Fardarbin and places like this, because in addition to the fact that people need food and shelter, there are some people, after all, there are some kihem chayinu v'erach yameinu. You need a little bit of Yiddishkeit, you need Torah chizuk also in there, but you can't go as a rabbi in Krakow or in Poland. They'll kill you. And so he, being the Cheverman that he was, as we'll talk about a little bit later, he got himself it's a figure like this. If he comes in as an army officer, at least they won't kill him. By the way, there he is meeting with the Jan Masaryk, the foreign minister of Czechoslovakia, for example. And here he is in Poland, running around in a carriage. Even so, there are places where they came close to killing him. They just couldn't make up their mind if he's a Jew or not. I mention this all because this shows you how bad conditions were to be Jewish physically in those areas in the years after the war. You'll hear some worse things before we're done tonight. Then they all go to Israel, to Palestine, and they interview the Yishuv. These are famous episodes over here. Weizmann, the usual suspects, Weizmann, Ben Gurion, et cetera, et cetera. And the Jewish community at that time in 1945 and 1946, like today, is still split between a left, a right, middle, and a center. And so, for example, obviously Chaim Weizmann is going to make the case, you have to bring in the Jewish refugees, we have to set up some kind of a Jewish state. Chaim Weizmann will do it in a nice way. Ben Gurion will do it in a not nice way, but that was his style. And then, of course, you also have these guys. There's Martin Buber and there's Judah Magnis, the president of Hebrew University. They're in favor of a Palestinian state, just with Jewish civil rights. You understand? We have, like you have today, Shalom Achshav and this sort of thing, in which we can, we can do it. This is when the Mufti was the head of the Palestinians. So nobody can be self-delusional like the Jews. But nevertheless, Martin Buber is a world-renowned philosopher, maybe the most famous Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. Judah Magnis was a very, very well-known person, an American Reform rabbi who converted to Zionism at a time in 1902 when the Reform movement was very anti-Zionist, and he made Aliyah early on in 1920 or so, in the 1920s, and was part and parcel of the founding of the Hebrew University, and the American nice, I mean this seriously, the American nice face of Zionism. running into the Middle Eastern realities. Remember we said before it's a humanitarian movement, not a political movement. He wanted a humanitarian, I mean this really, wanted humanitarian Zionism, and not one that'll lead to violence, that was what the Arabs would clash about. Let's work something out with the Arabs. And they get a lot of play, as you can imagine, in the international press. I mean, there's an Arab listening into them. And then they also interview the Palestinians, obviously. Who are the Palestinians? Well, I'm going to speak about this more next week. But the Palestinian society, then like today, had this violence problem. There's a few actors in charge who'll kill anybody who gets out of line. And they terrorize and therefore keep everybody in a certain line of thought, and therefore brainwash the young people to follow this. This was the Husseini family in those days. The Mufti was Amin al-Husseini, his brother was Jamal al-Husseini, etc., etc. Jamal al-Husseini was arrested by the British in 1940-41 when he and his brother, the Mufti, were helping the Germans take over Iraq, if you can follow all that, which the British stopped, and he was sent to a jail in Rhodesia during the war as a political prisoner. But then when the war's over, they let him go back, because after all, he's the head of the Palestinians, and the fact that he helped the Germans doesn't stop the British from, letting him take his quote-unquote rightful place as the head of the Arabs. And he's the one now talking to the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry, and Albert Hourani, that was the Arab Abba Iban, the educated fellow from Oxford, and of course, total rejection. No Jews, not one should be allowed into Israel. 100,000, forget it. A Jewish state, forget it. Anything else, forget it. The way to do it is the British should leave now. Let it, the majority population, because it's 2-1. It's 1.2, 1.3 million Arabs. Let the Arabs take over. Let it be a state like any other Arab state. As for the Jews, Gitzach and Eitzah. That's what they said. And it's, let me tell you something. This was the best thing ever happened to the Zionists. Because all during 1945, 46, 47, 48, the Arabs, particularly Palestinians, will present to Western minds a very unreasonable posture. You understand? If it's all about winning, then you think in different terms. True? Sometimes you have an argument with somebody and you want to pound the table and all the rest of it. Not with your wife, of course, or your spouse, but I've heard such things happen on the West Coast. You can pound and scream, or you can win. If you think about winning, you deploy a different face. The Arabs didn't see it that way. The Mufti couldn't speak. He was still a war criminal. He died a war criminal, I might say, in 1971. He was in hiding. The Palestinian people, or the leadership anyway, refused to repudiate him. This smelled in 1945. It's not today. People still remembered Hitler. It was just fresh. And the Palestinians refused to repudiate him. Jamal Husseini is his mouthpiece. He's the spokesman. He's the official spokesman for the Palestinian cause, as I just mentioned before. Tarred with a Nazi past. That was very good for the Jews. In general, as I said, this bespeaks the poisonous Husseini hold on Palestinian society. Anybody got out of line, bad things happen to them. So you don't get out of line. But as a result, you don't have a politics either. You just have a rejectionist politics, which is not a policy. It's interesting. Therefore, the Jews have these guys. Maybe they don't represent the majority, but they're Jewish moderates. There are no Arab moderates. Ben Gurion in those days used to say all the time like this: where is the Arab Magnus? Like we say today, we have Israelis who want to give everything back. Where is the Palestinian equivalent of that? There is none. It's the asymmetry which is so striking to us today. This went on for the first several months of 1946. In May of 1946, just to keep the line straight, the committee issues its report. It's a long piece, but bottom line is they say it's no Jewish state. Yes, 100,000 Jews should be let in. So it's a humanitarian thing. And if the Arabs would be smart, they say yes, and they would defuse the issue. And after all, there were 550,000 Jews in Palestine. Another 100,000 not really going to make a difference. 600,000, even 200,000 not going to make a difference. 750,000. We took in all the DPs. Everybody from Hitler wants to go to Israel is allowed to go to Israel. Shine? Okay, now let's look at the final solution of the political problem. The majority is Arab. Let's go. Let's have elections. It'll be an Arab state. You understand? So you could look at it in May of 1946 in June as something terrible. Because as I said before, the final recommendation of this official committee of the British government, the American government, is if you cut to the chase and get rid of all the window dressing, it's an Arab state. You understand? They just let in a couple of refugees. At the worst, it'll continue to be under the British. Right? Or maybe I should say the best. It'll continue to be under the British. But it won't be a Jewish state. Forget that. Ben Gurion and many people are furious. James MacDonald, we said before, right? Well, you met with Ben Gurion. He says, don't do that. Don't look at the glass being half empty. Look at the glass being half full. That's the way you should play it, which is very interesting in the political. Don't protest. Don't cuss out Truman and all that, which the Jewish organizations had immediately started to do. Because, well, listen, there's a reason. If you accept this, if the Jews will all get on board, then it's an Arab state. You understand? Not today, not tomorrow, but in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it'll be an Arab state. And so I understand, he says, why you're angry, but that's not smart. Use this and not this. Use your mind and not your heart. Oh boy, they have all these interviews. McDonald goes to see Truman, and Truman said, damn the Jews, this and that and the other. They're a bunch of this. Oh, you really cussed him out because he was under tremendous pressure. And his mind, I think you see, his mind, he was the best friend of the Jews. He thought he was doing well, but they don't see it that way. And they're a bunch of ungrateful, this and that and the other. And he says, Jesus wasn't good enough for them. How do they expect me to be? And all this. I mean, he has all kind of it's very interesting kind of rhetoric. And James MacDonald, also is not Jewish, he said to Truman, if you've lived among them as long as I have, you will soon learn that the Jews are always blamed by others for their own weakness, as Bevin is doing. It's interesting. Anyway, there's the politics side of all this, which we're going to address in a minute. The American politics. 1946 election year for Congress. Truman was a weak president, I emphasize again, I mentioned before. He never did command a large majority. He wasn't Roosevelt, obviously. And there were a lot of problems during the Truman years, which are left over from the Second World War. I mean, there were unbelievable union trouble, strikes all the time. The economy, had bottlenecks, because it's obviously very hard to shift over from the total war economy that you had during the war to a civilian economy, and we understand that. And, it's a question, should the government get rid of its price controls, which they had here once upon a time? Should they get rid of the rationing? In the black market, America was going through such a period. And so there's 1,001 domestic problems. There's 1,001 Cold War problems, as I mentioned already. And now you got the Jews also. And I'm trying to help them. And they're coming on here. So it was a whole business. But what MacDonald said, and others like that to Truman and to Ben Gurion, is why concentrate on the negative? Why don't you concentrate on the positive? Meaning, say like this: there are good things in the report, and there are bad things in the report. I like the good things. I'm not crazy about the bad things. The good things in the report are 100,000 Jews now. And the bad things in the report, we'll talk about some other time. In politics, you can perhaps do that. Truman started to get the polls, and he was worried. And so he asked Abihail Silver, the head of the Zionists, who you'll see in a minute didn't get along with, to draft a public statement of what is his response to the committee, his report. And naturally, Abihail Silver says like this: this is a great report. The 100,000, it should be the first thing that's implemented, in there. And Truman put it out. And the British blew a gut, obviously. And what are the British? They're crazy. He didn't even consult with the British government. He just gave this out as a press report written by the head of the Zionists, and this is the summer when the congressional primaries are happening right now, so none of this has to do with politics, obviously. And the British are really going mad, and he writes blistering letters to Truman. He makes a speech in Parliament. We'll consider all this about the 100,000, but of course, first the Jews have to turn in all their weapons. Well, because they have their Irgun and Haganah and all that sort of thing. Well, that's a great idea. And by the way, they'll consider it, but first you have to give me your guns. Give me your gun, and then I'll consider it. So you understand what's going on there. And Ernest Bevin makes a very famous speech at that time where he said, quote, this is Bevin speaking to the annual conference of the British Labour Party, which he's the head of. And of course he says, I hope I will not be misunderstood in America if I say that this proposal to bring in 100,000 Jews in Palestine was proposed with the purest of motives. They do not want too many Jews in New York. So Abihail Silver gave a speech a week later. He said, "Do not worry, Mr. Bevin. No one misunderstands the purity of your motives. In fact, that's precisely why we are Zionists. We do not wish to be at the whim and the mercy of people like you. We wish to be free and independent, and we intend to be whether you like it or not. Whether or not it's inconvenient for the interests of the British Empire, and I say that with the purest of motives," unquote. All of which means that now we are in quote-unquote the Zionist hour, because this guy became, for 3 years, like a meteor, a super thing, and then he totally fades from the scene. It's quite interesting. Abihail Silver was born in Lithuania, grew up in New York, became early in the early 1900s a Reform rabbi in the old classical days of the super, no yarmulke, no Aron Kodesh. No Aron Kodesh, no nothing, and obviously totally anti-Zionism and anything like this. He was one of the great orators, maybe the greatest. Him and Stephen Wise were the two top speakers. And when I say oratory, I don't mean just people who have a good voice and bloviate. I'm talking about people with ideas, that they have substance. And so he was a magnificent orator and a thinker, and he became a rabbi in Cleveland. He had a small shtetl, and then he was a rabbi in Cleveland. They called it the Temple. It's the number one temple, Reform temple in Cleveland and Ohio and that whole area. And he built it up even more. So by the time he's finished, you're talking about 2,000 families or something like that, which is big today and was very big in those days especially. The people there are not Zionists or anything like this at all. And he's a classical Reform. And you may be surprised to learn they didn't have services on Saturday. They had services on Sunday. That's what it was at that time. Well, that's what it was. And this is the German Jews. Now, he was a Litvisher, but he reinvented himself in Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College, which is what they did to become civilized. And the result is that he became a very prominent Reform rabbi in 1915. I want you to understand the background of all this. The Reform movement, as I say before, officially was very anti-Zionist, but they, in Reform Judaism, has from then until today always granted autonomy to the individual rabbis. So you can't make anybody do anything. And there were a few nuts, like Stephen Wise and Abihail Silver, who were Zionists. They were considered a little bit weird. But on the other hand, in every other respect, it was totally with Reform Judaism, one of the great icons. So here's a guy who goes across the country. If he wanted to, he could be scholar in residence 52 weeks a year, 152 weeks a year. He's a tremendous speaker and a thinker also within the context of Reform Judaism. He is also very interested in Zionism. So what I'm talking about. One year he's the president of Reform this, next year he's the national president of the ZOA, and then another time the head of UJA. As he went through all those typical, usual establishment committee kinds of posts that we all know. And listen, he was just a tremendous orator, but he never was really interested in political Zionism that much. He was into Zionism, but it was Zionism primarily, as I said before, of the cultural variety. In the late 1930s, so I mentioned last year, when Jabotinsky was sneaking Jews into Israel on the first Ha'apala, the first illegal immigration, Abihail Silver was making speeches that this is terrible. And that's the mode that he was in at that particular time. But I think the Holocaust changed him, as many. But the difference is, he was a real bossy type of guy. He wasn't easy to be around. He took control of his temple totally. And anybody that's around him, you're either his way or get out. That's the type of personality he was. He was really stark as it goes, so he's a turn on or a turn off. But he is capable and a powerful thinker and an imposing personality. And when he came to the conclusion that the Jewish people, and he thought like a Jew, like a Jewish Jew, more than anyone else, more than Ben Gurion, you'll see before I'm done, if tonight or this series. Very fascinating as a human being. And when he came to the conclusion that Jewish policies are leading to their own detriment and the world is all against us, all the rest of it. So he turned and he said, let's totally reorganize over here. And from 1943 to 48, these were his years when he got very involved in redirecting, seizing control, as he tried to, of the American Zionist movement, actually creating a real movement when there had just been a bunch of societies, after all, each one patting themselves on the back, and fighting the hold that the mainline regular American Jewish organizations have always had with the rigor mortis, the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish this and this group and that group. We always say, still, don't do anything, don't make noise. We're handing this behind the closed doors. And he turned it around, and he said, we're going to war. You know, American Jewry has to go to war, and against their own government, against everybody. We're allowed to do it in this country, so we're going to do it. No, it's legally. And he was amazing, as I say, orator. I remember many years ago, Rabbi Weinberg, all of a sudden from there, Yisrael, told me when he was learning at Chaim Berlin in the 1940s, he was a bacher. So he was a young man. He went to it, and that's when all this was going on. So he said he went to Manhattan to hear a speech by Abba Hill Silver, and I know what he's talking about in 43 and 44, when he was trying to take control of the Zionist movement. And so they had all these rallies and these national, I'm not going to bore you with the details, national conferences, and the different groups get together. And he went into a place that was packed, like Madison Square Garden, and everybody was against him. And he gave this speech, and everybody votes for him. Now that's a koach, right? He said he never forgot it, you see. So in 1943 and 44, and then really in 45, Silver creates the AZAC, the American Zionist Emergency Committee. He creates a machinery to introduce genuine, real organization to American Jewry for the first and I think the only time. The American way, organized from the bottom up. We call it democracy in this country. You can get anything done if you've got the patience to roll up your sleeves and get out there and go all over the country and create an organization from the bottom up and go after any particular law or idea that you want to do it, so you're allowed to do it. And if you are willing to put time and effort and sweat and lose sleep and talk and agitate, you will get it. That's how things are done in this country. Those who want the easy way with a few lobbyists behind the doors, that works sometimes. But if you want to do something that's against the grain, you can do it, but you've got to be willing to put in the effort. You understand? I'm talking about the real effort. I'm not talking flash in the pan, something that's in for 2 weeks, Occupy Wall Street or something like that. I'm talking about creating an organization from the bottom up. Here's a guy who was a reform rabbi for 30 years. He knows the American Jewish system inside out. He knows rabbis and organizations from all over the place. He knows the strengths and the weaknesses and the potential strengths of the American Jewish community. He knows it's totally untapped, and he knows what needs to be done. It's like this. You go to every town, and large and small, you get in touch with every shul, every temple, every Jewish organization, every B'nai B'rith, every this, that, and the other, and you get them together, you speak to them, you tell them, listen, this is what needs to be done. We're getting killed, we're getting destroyed in Europe. Nobody's doing anything about it. Don't trust Roosevelt. Don't trust any of these people. We got to do it, and you got to get on board. And here's the plan. You're going to be the secretary, you're going to be the recording person, you're going to be the treasurer, you're going to get me a list. This is before the era of computers, so you have to compile the list of the people, and we have to hit on each and every one of them. You know what I'm saying? The really creating a kind of political party from the ground up is quite remarkable, but his whole career had kind of prepared him for this, because he knew American Jewry inside out, and he creates a fighting Zionism. His slogan that he went all over the country, Al tiftichu ben divim, do not put not thy trust in princes. Do not trust Roosevelt, don't trust anybody, because they will lie. You understand? If you rely on the good wishes of the others, you deserve what you get. L'audace, toujours l'audace. These are his famous cries. Frederick the Great said, you charge in audacity, always audacity. Notice, if you take on something, do it. Don't be the little yiddle in the back that hopes that something, it won't work that way. It's not how this country runs. If you want to do something fundamental, you can do it, but you have to do what's necessary over there. He scorned the Zionist establishment, all those groups, as well as the quote-unquote leaders of the Jewish organizations. On the other hand, he did hook up with the right people, Henry Monter, to get the federations on board and all this. He, like I said, I could give a whole course, and I'm not being funny when I say it, on this period in Jewish history. I could tell you bit by bit all the fights, the dirty Lashon Hara, and the kind of internecine organizational battles that happened in American Jewry, because he didn't call me and this one didn't do this and I didn't get credit over here. It was a pain in the neck, but he made it happen. Now, he was aided by the terrible effects of the Holocaust, which by 43, 44, and 45 are really starting to register with people. And he says, listen, we're going to do it. We have to charge ahead. He forthrightly opposes Roosevelt, which is not done, and he forthrightly opposes the religion of the Democratic Party, meaning most Jews at that time were just blindly Democrat. And he said, this is counterproductive for Jews. You have to be in both parties, and don't trust any of them. We are all familiar. I mean, even today, look, I had a very good friend Jerry Safran, we always had this joke. I said he was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I said, what if Hitler was running on the Democratic ticket and Ramosha Feinstein on the Republican ticket? He said, I have to give it careful consideration. You know. Yeah, if that's true now. I mean, think of the 1940s, and so as a result of his agitation and leadership, and the people who helped him, of course, he didn't do it one by him by himself. He had a very strong support in somebody, Emmanuel Newman, whose picture I couldn't get for you, who had been that was a guy who really was a political Zionist, and he made his living that way. Early when they had been friends at the same Pirchei club in Williamsburg when they're growing up, when they were young, and they got together in 1939, and they said, we have to turn around American Jewry around. It takes years and years to do it, but it needs to be done if we are to do anything about getting a Jewish state, because they're thinking in those terms. I'm not interested in humanitarianism, and we're not interested in other people giving us a few drops from their becher. We need a state. Jewish Commonwealth was the term at that time, and it's going to happen now. And if it's inconvenient for you, it's inconvenient for me now. I'd rather be inconvenient for you than be inconvenient for me, and that kind of attitude. And so as a result, for the first and the only time I can think of, American Jewry gets truly united and mobilized across the board. Opposition is crushed. There are Jews who strongly object to what I just said. This came the American Council of Judaism. These were super Reformed Jews who are very bothered for a variety of reasons by everything I just described. The idea of super Zionism, especially pushing for a Jewish state, it's anathema to them, and it violates the Ten Commandments as they understand it of Judaism. Here's Elmer Berger, the famous rabbi who was the head of the organization for many years. Here's Rabbi Lazaron, if anybody remembers him from Baltimore, at the I think the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, who was a very famous one. Again, he was one of the great orators of the Reform movement, who was Zionist and then turned, because he said, I came to conclude that Zionism is immoral and the whole idea of a Jewish state is wrong. Yeah, I'm telling you. And he lost his job ultimately as a result. That this is what he believed. And here's Lessing Rosenwald, one of the wealthiest Jews in the United States. These guys bankrolled and ran something called the American Council for Judaism to mobilize support among Jews across the country, at least Reform Jews, against all this, because it's un-American and it's un-Jewish. They have whole books. I mean, it's quite remarkable. They have books where you can get from the library. Nobody reads them anymore. How everything I just described about getting Eretz Yisrael is anti-Jewish. You see, ever since the destruction of the temple, the prophets preach universalism, which transcends anything Jewish. They read, of course, the Bible, as everybody does, skipping pages. You want the parts that you want. So, you can find parts of Isaiah which says that Kibesi based Tefillah Yikari Yechol Amim, that we want a universalism. You also find other parts in Isaiah who says, up with Israel, let's all return from the Gullus and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. That part doesn't count. So that's what they did. By and large, though, they're ultra-Reformed Jews. The Reform movement, under the pressures of Abba Hill Silver and others, turns for the first time ever. In the middle of the Second World War, they have huge battles within Reform Judaism, and they change. They come out in favor of a Jewish army and a Jewish, not a Jewish state yet, but in favor of Zionism and everything in there. And a lot of people in the Reform movement didn't like it. I've said here many times, I know I mentioned last year that Rabbi Erwin Reichert, who was that kind of rabbi in San Francisco, had the huge temple, I forget what it's called over there. And exactly during this years, he lost his job. Right? Except that there, he lost his job because he was so strongly against Zionism in the wake of the Holocaust. One vote. When the synagogue had to renew the contract, he lost one vote. And it turned out the one vote was from a lady, because she came to vote late. And they asked her, he says, were you against him because of the Zionism issue? And she says, Zionism has nothing to do with it. He said, why do you vote against the rabbi? He said, I cannot forgive the fact that in 1942, he did not come and pay a shiva kol on me when my dog died. Abba Hill Silver forthrightly opposes the Truman Doctrine. He forthrightly opposes the Marshall Plan. Notice he's very politically incorrect. This is thing. Is this good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? See, that's how he's saying it. What do we get out of this? You understand? This was heresy in the post-war period, and he formed very close ties already in the 1930s with Mr. Republican Robert Taft. Some of you may know Robert Taft was, of course, the leader of the right wing of the Republican Party, who 4 or 5 times tried to get in, and the left wing of the Republican Party kept him out of office. But he had a tremendous following across the country, a very great friend of the Jewish people. It doesn't make any sense. I thought if somebody's a conservative Republican, he's going to be an anti-Semite. It's not true. That's what Abba Hill-Silber kept saying. He said, what is all this junk I hear? This guy will do more, people like him will do more to help get Israel than all your guys out there. This was his argument. See, going against the grain, but he didn't just do it. I mean, he made impassioned speeches and logical arguments to support his opinions. Here is Robert Taft, who was a senator from Ohio until he died. 2 of his biggest supporters are Silver and Silver. He used to say like this, I run on the silver power. Well, listen, it's Ohio even today is a 2-party state. The elections in Ohio, are close even today. It's one of those few states like that, right? Most states are pretty much blue states or red states, but you understand what I'm saying. Ohio is always up for grabs. Robert Taft was elected in the 1930s during the middle of the New Deal, and that means that the voters are voting for Roosevelt, but they're also voting for Taft. It's a funny kind of a thing. And I don't know if you know this, and you probably don't. Robert Taft's the son of President William Howard Taft. They're from Cincinnati. They're great friends of the Jewish people. William Howard Taft was not very famous as an American president necessarily. That's debatable. But he was there. He had a lot of fights with Jews, by the way. I spoke about this in the past, about the Russian treaty and all in 1912. But in spite of all that, he was there when the Jews needed him. And especially in 1920, when Henry Ford started a whole agitation in this country and got a lot of traction with his Dearborn Independent, and really, he wanted to start, he's the guy to do it, he had the money to start a national anti-Semitic movement over there. Hitler dedicates Mein Kampf to my hero, Henry Ford. So one of the main people that led the charge against him was William Howard Taft, who was out of office and soon became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. In fact, Taft was one of the people that drafted that famous letter that I think I read over here that they published in all the papers in early January 1921, which was an address to the Christians of America by like 100 names of famous Christians. Right? He was the second one, Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft, where it says, "We believe it should not be left to men and women of the Jewish faith to fight this evil, but anti-Semitism, but it is in a very special sense the duty of citizens who are not Jewish by ancestry and faith. We therefore make earnest protest against this vicious propaganda, and we call upon our fellow citizens of Gentile birth and Christian faith to unite their efforts to ours to the end that it may be crushed." And he goes on and on about this. So he was a friend of the Jewish people. He was opposed to Brandeis, but he was a friend of the Jewish people. And there was a Red Scare. There's a lot to it, and he was the heir to that tradition. He was a friend with Rabbi Eliezer Silver. Some of you may possibly recall that when he became the rabbi in Cincinnati, he wanted to build a mikveh over there, and the mayor, who was the head of the reform movement, blocked it. And Taft, who was the leading lawyer at that time in Cincinnati, took the case as a civil liberties case. And as soon as he took the case, they folded, because they didn't want to go in the paper trying to crush a religious thing against Robert Taft. And they sent him a check, and he tore it up. Right? So he had connections, interesting, with the Jewish people, with Rabbi Silver of this variety and Rabbi Silver of that variety, and especially of this guy, Rabbi Hill-Silver. And therefore, I can tell you right now, this is not so well known, but the Republicans will win the election big time in 1946. So the state of Israel will happen with a Republican Congress. We often forget that. And one of the, not the only reason, but one of the reasons it happens is the very strong support given to the Zionists by Robert Taft. And the fact you have an arch-Republican on this side was a tremendous chizuk, as they say, for the Jewish position. Because you can't it's hard to say it's un-American if a guy like Taft is pushing it. Now, on the other hand, he was his own man. I'll give you an example. He was opposed to the Nuremberg trials. This is famous. He held, as a lawyer, it bothered him that they're trying people for crimes that were not official. There's no books, there's no crime in the book called genocide. You understand? You can only try somebody for something that's an existing law at the time. And since there wasn't there, so it can't be. Robert Jackson, who was the American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, a very famous Supreme Court justice, he made a famous several-hour-long speech precisely to make the case that there is a law against this. Understand? It's not on the books, but it's like understood, And, they're both interesting positions. So we're talking over here about people, real people, they were thinkers. And anyway, he is a big supporter, as I say before, of the efforts of people like Abba Hillel Silver and the others, which means that they're going against Truman. I want you to understand what's going on. If Silver could bring all these people along to do that and going against the Democrats, it was quite remarkable. Anyway, in response to Bevin, Silver and Taft lead a very strong attack on the 1946 loan to England. Oh, you want to cut off the 100,000 Jews? And you want to do this, and you want to do this to the Jews, and want to make it out of state? I don't want to give a, we'll fight that you shouldn't get a penny. Now, Stephen Wise and the others say, that's cheating, right? You can't do that. We need England. England will go under. He says, whoa, how's that work? You understand? And basically, Abba Hillel Silver was like this. He says, they're allowed to go for their interest. I'm allowed to go for my interest. You understand? I mean, there's a new type of Jewish activism that had never been seen before. The British and the State Department were obviously furious. Many Jews freak out in a big way. Silver didn't care. He said, damn the torpedoes. That's his famous. He said, damn the torpedoes. And he went ahead. The British were therefore super angry as 1946 proceeds, but they were scared. It got really tense. Truman called him in. He said, you should let the British loan go through. Him and Abba Hillel Silver got into a shouting match with each other. Truman said, get the hell out of here. Never want to see you again. That's what he said. And, and afterwards he says, the damn Jews this and that and the other. He has all these things against the Jews. Listen, let's be honest. Jews can be obnoxious and get on your nerves. You're all laughing. You don't agree with what I'm saying? At the same time, all this is happening, let us not forget that the Bergson group was still operating. They're still, that's Ben Hecht. These are the pro-Jabotinsky guys who during the Second World War, during the war, were constantly agitating to get Jews out and rescue them. Now that the war's over, they're taking out ads in the New York Times and all over the country in favor of the Irgun. I mean, Ben Hecht was the leading writer in Hollywood, and during these years, I think he went over the top because he says, these are put in the Washington Post and places like that. Every time a British soldier is killed, a little song goes off in the hearts of American Jews. It's a little bit, in there. Truman was super crazy angry over all this, which you can understand, but the elections are coming up. 1946 was an interesting time. Agreed? And there were those who were afraid that Truman would just totally blow his top and say like this, okay, we're cutting off all interest in the Jews and let them do it on their own. At that point, his best friend comes to try to calm him down. Before we start this, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that Truman had been in the business with Eddie Jacobson. I'm sure you all know that, right? It looks like an educated crowd. And if you know, you don't know, I'll tell you exactly what it is right now, because then I'll show you the movie. It's really cool. It's amazing what you can find now. Truman was from, as you know, from Kansas City, from Independence, Missouri. And a little town, it's basically Kansas City. And when he never went to college. So after high school, he worked in a bank for a while. He worked here, he worked there. He was a teller in a bank. And Eddie Jacobson was a New York Jew. His family moved to Kansas, ended up in Kansas City. And he was 14, 15 years old, and he used to bring the payroll every day, to the bank. So they got to know each other that way. Then the war broke out, the First World War, and they ended up in the same military unit. And in the regiment and the brigade, the competition was, and you get extra points and maybe a promotion, whoever has the best canteen. So Truman said, I guess I'm getting a Jew. That's what he writes. And him and this guy hooked up, and they had the best canteen. They sold the most, right? That's what it was. And as a result, they got all kind of awards. And Truman actually got a promotion, I think, from lieutenant to captain or something like that. And he said like this, the trick is to have the right Jew. That's what he said. But in reality, even though he used to talk very harsh, they became very close friends. And when the war was over, the First World War, so he didn't have a college education or anything like this. He just got married, so what are you supposed to do? So they opened a clothing store, haberdashery store in Kansas City, which failed because of the depression of 1921, 1922. So Truman went on his way and went to a career in politics. And A. Jacobson went on to be a salesman on the road and eventually do the store again. And when you see this picture, I found the other day a film clip in color made in some kind of newsreel in late 1945, exactly the time we're talking about. not long after Truman came in office. And it's all about Harry Truman, the new president, a regular American, and how he came from humble beginnings to where he is now, and all that kind of thing. And one of the things they do in color pictures is they take all the places we grew up. This is his house where he's born in Lamar, and this is in Independence, Missouri, and here's in Kansas City, all the rest of it. And you'll see in a second, he says, and here's the store they had, which is now they don't say the guy's name, and they don't say he's Jewish. Okay? But they said, here's the guy who he went into business with, and when they failed, they still paid their debts and all the rest of it. And this person is still best friends with the president because Truman was this kind of a guy. Every time he visited Kansas City, he always made sure to buy something at the guy's store to help him with the business. You understand? They're from that kind of a background. So it's a very close relationship. Take a look at this.
Shortly after being discharged from the Army, Harry Truman and a soldier friend established this clothing store in Kansas City. But along came an
There he is.
which caused the business to fail. And it is to the everlasting credit of Harry S. Truman that he slaved for 15 years to pay back every dollar that was owed. His former partner, who still owns the store, and the president are still the best of friends.
And that's all they tell you over there now. But you get I think that tells the whole story. So this was one of the Jewish entrees into the White House. Every time he was screaming, cursing the Jews, all the rest of it, somebody in the White House would call this guy from Kansas City. Said, I think you should come and talk to Truman, and he did do so, and he would calm down, and and he never told anybody what he spoke to the president about. It's famous that after he had his whole meeting over here, and after he came out, the reporters were saying, what'd you talk about and what's all the rest of it? And he says, I used to sell the president socks and then ties, and now I sell him notions. Right? So, they had that kind of relationship. I can tell you, when Truman left office, in January of 1953, he had big plans to go with this guy visit Eretz Yisrael. He said this is something they planned a long time to go to the Holy Land and all the rest of it, but A. Jacobson got sick and died. Right? But in other words, they really were very close friends. And this is, like I say before, the other side of Truman. You can't go by the fact that you find somebody, Nixon, whoever it is, who says, oh, the damn Jews, this, that, and the other. That doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story at all. Many of us, seriously, have a thing where you blow up, but it doesn't really mean anything, as opposed to other people. Jewish history is full of people that it meant something, unfortunately. I don't think Truman was like that at all. But what do you do now? They have these hundreds of thousands of refugees. Actually, more and more are pouring into the American zone all the time from all over Europe because they're running away from anti-Semitism everywhere else. The army doesn't know what to do with them. They got to go somewhere. And Truman himself, as a humanitarian, wanted to do something for them. The British said they can't go into Israel. He says, what about 100,000 people? They're not going to do it. Like, where's it going? What are we supposed to do? At that point, the number 2 guy in the State Department got involved, Dean Acheson, who was very close with Truman. He was in in Truman's first administration, the Undersecretary of State from 1945 to 47, exactly in the period we're talking about. Later on, he was Truman's Secretary of State in the second term. The two men became closer than friends. Even today, if you follow the journalists, all the rest of it, whenever you talk about President and Secretary of State, Truman Acheson is the gold standard, because they had complete confidence in each other. And Acheson, a very interesting guy, came from not a wealthy family, but had the brains to get through Yale and then Harvard Law School. He became a very big attorney. He clerked for Brandeis because his professor got him the job named Felix Frankfurter. And Felix Frankfurter became his best friend. And do we have the picture of the two of them? Oh, anyway, he says Frankfurt and him used to literally they spent all their time together. Acheson was the attorney for Frankfurter at the confirmation hearings in 1939 when Frankfurter was nominated for the Supreme Court post. So in other words, they're very close. And there were a couple other people like that. He was a big enemy of Hitler. He was one of the people early on that supported Roosevelt in the fight against fascism and all the rest of it. His father was an Episcopal bishop in Connecticut. I can tell you this story. It's an interesting story. There was a Russian Jew who lived in that guy's parish in Connecticut, and he got sick, tuberculosis, and he died, and he left in his will that the bishop should raise his son, but he should raise him as a Jew, and he did do so. So in other words, you're not going to say that this was anti-Semitic. On the other hand, he had complete disapproval of Zionism because, as I've tried to outline for you, it's against America's interest in the Cold War. There's an argument that could be said for that. Acheson writes in his memoirs, he said, from my constant dealings with Brandeis and Frankfurt and others, I got to understand, but never to share their passion for ending the diaspora and rebuilding the land of Israel. This is one area in which these great American Jews allowed their emotions to get in the way of their national interest. I mean, this was his opinion. So, on the other hand, he wants to help Truman. He wants to get the whole thing solved. So he decides to get involved over here. And he says, let's professionally consider the whole report, not just the part about 100,000 Jews. How about the whole report? Which you and I know means no Jewish state. This would kill any possibility of a Jewish state. And so in July of 1946, he sends two diplomats, Morrison and Grady. This was the British guy, Herbert Morrison, who later became the foreign secretary. And here's a very well-known American ambassador, Henry Grady. In other words, people have nothing to do whatsoever with Jewish stuff. And let's look at this professionally and calmly and coldly and see what we can come up with. And they put together basically a British kind of plan called the Morrison-Grady plan, which essentially goes like this. You'll give about 15% of Israel for a Jewish part, you give the rest for an Arab part, a little bit for the British part. The British will remain in charge. It'll be a federal state like Switzerland, which the cantons will have internal policy. Then, under some system, you'll be able to take in Jews over 5 years to bring in 100,000 or something like that. You know, that kind of whole approach. Truman loved the plan, but you and I know it's a Palestinian state. In other words, either it's a Jewish state or it isn't. If it's not, then it's an Arab state. And so Truman thought it'd be great, but Avihl Silver went viral, and Taft and Ed Flynn, the leader of the Democrats in New York, people are not Jewish. They all go after the Morrison-Grady report, and they said this is a Nazi plan, this is this, that, and the other. Truman goes up the wall. Acheson gets angry, but he says, "I am helpless before the Zionist onslaught." You understand? Avihl Silver had cranked up a situation where you could put in 50,000 telegrams overnight. It's remarkable. You understand? I mean, when people write to their congressmen, handwritten letters, they listen, especially in those days. It's not email. When you are a senator or a congressman from some Durban, a little place, and you start getting handwritten letters by the tens and the 20s and the hundreds, you're going to change. That is the way it goes, because nobody's really committed to anti-Jewish state that much, not in 1946. And so the result was, you had a lot of politics going on over here, and the Republicans win the election, and the Morrison-Grady report, therefore, was dead in the water. I might say the Arabs rejected also. They said, I like the Arab state part, but we don't want 100,000 Jews. They want to get rid of the Jews that they have already. Just before the election, Nachum Goldman, who was a well-known Zionist leader, he proposed an upgraded version of Morrison-Grady. Now, since you're talking about a Jewish part and an Arab part, why not just make two states, partition? He sells Acheson on it. Acheson sells Truman on it. And in Yom Kippur of 1946, Truman issues his Yom Kippur speech, my fellow Americans of the Jewish faith, in which he favors the immediate, quote, the immediate immigration of 100,000 Jews and the creation of a viable Jewish state in control of part of Palestine. It's the first time ever the President of the United States or anybody in the world spoke actually the words about having a Jewish state. So from being all against it and cussing out the Jews and all this kind of stuff, he turned on a dime. It was a few weeks before the election, and he wasn't that against it. It just wasn't part of his way of thinking. He doesn't like to do it, but he'll do it if necessary. And for the President of the United States to come out and talk about a independent Jewish state, even in part of Palestine, is unbelievable. The World Zionist Congress meets very shortly afterwards. Under all these pressures, Weizmann and as I last week, and Stephen Wise, who are the moderates, are kicked out of power. Ben-Gurion takes over from Weizmann, and Avihl Silver takes over from Stephen Wise. And the idea is we're going to make a fight for the Jewish state. I'm talking about a political fight. But how? By early of 1947, the British have no more plan that they can think of that is acceptable to the Jews or the Arabs. On the other hand, you can't keep the status quo. Menachem Begin is seeing to that. You understand? With the terrorism, it just wasn't working, the status quo. So where's it going to go? What are you going to do? In March and April of 1947, the British have all kind of internal conferences of their own. And in April 2nd of 1947, Bevin basically says, the heck with the whole thing. Let the United Nations figure out what to do with it. Britain can return the mandate back to the United Nations. After all of a sudden they became tzaddikim. After all, it was never part of the British Empire. England, as a matter of public interest, took this territory over as a mandate from the League of Nations after the First World War to help out. If the people don't want us, then Vakasha, take it back. That way he'll get it. Now, secretly, he figured like this. The United Nations won't be able to do anything about this. No one can square the circle of Arab-Israeli intransigence, and we'll have to turn it back to England, who'll then be able to say, well, we told you so, now we can do whatever we want. This was a big gamble he had. It's also true, by the way, that Harold Bealey, the head of the Foreign Office, said, in order for anything to happen in terms of partition, you'd have to get America and Russia to agree. It's the Cold War. America and Russia don't agree on anything. If they say they want chocolate, they want vanilla. You know, they don't agree on anything. And yet, 1 month later, to everyone's total shock, while this is being in there, the British are freaked out. Andre Gromyko, who many of us still remember, look how young he was, the ambassador to America at the time of Roosevelt and Truman. Now, he goes back a long way. He was the ambassador to the United States in 1943 already. Goes back a long way. This time he was the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, and he gives a famous surprise speech where he says, we are in favor. We would like the Soviet Union would back a joint state, but if that's not possible, which is what we'd like, then, okay, the Jews, after what they've gone through, this is what he says, Jews, after what we've gone through, deserve a state, which is a shock. I can tell you right now, I'll speak about this more hopefully next time, but till this day, nobody knows why it happened. Because, the Russians don't give their secrets away. It doesn't make any sense. This guy didn't exactly love Jews, So, no, I'm serious. So, I mean, in 1947, this guy's in the middle of a whole bunch of purges and killings of Jews. So it's like weird that they would make such a, but he did. And the British are blowed over. On May, it's happening on April, May of 47. In May 20th of 47, the United Nations, having been given this, appoints a committee. That's what you do. UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. General Marshall, who by now is the Secretary of State. They've been the guy Burns, and then now it's Marshall, the Secretary of State in 1947. He says right away, as you'll see in a second, America is neutral on the subject of partition. Doesn't want to get the Arabs angry or anything like this. Doesn't want to get the Jews angry at Truman. We're trying to walk a thin line. And so we are completely, impartial, and we want everybody in the country to be impartial. Yeah, right. Take a look at this.
Marshall was worried that war would break out.
Here's General Marshall.
In the midst of a very critical situation. We should therefore carefully avoid approaching international problems on an emotional basis.
I wonder what he's talking about. Anyway, I might say that Lloyd Henderson, the chief diplomat in the State Department on Middle Eastern matters, who is a sworn enemy of Zionism, he actually gives out speeches and says, we favor the Arabs. And that's what it is. So much for the impartiality, all the rest of it. In June, now the tempo picks up. In June of 47, the UNSCOP arrives in Palestine. So here we go again. Except that now the Arabs make another fundamental mistake. Listen to this. They boycott the UNSCOP. They said, you can't partition our country. You can't take it. It's not for grabs. So this whole idea of coming over here to study the possibility of partition is an insult, and therefore we wouldn't have nothing to do with it. So as a result, they were supposed to appoint Jewish liaison officers to accompany the committee and Arab liaison officers to accompany the committee. But the Arabs say, we're not going to send anybody. They boycott. So the Jews send Abba Eban. So all day long, when they're touring Palestine, they're getting one side. I know you're shocked to hear that, but they're getting one side. And that's how they got their objective report. This is the leader, not the leader, the secretary of the committee was the famous American black Ralph Bunche, who was a PhD from Harvard and had political science department at Howard University and was a deputy secretary of state even on Roosevelt. Knows he's a very cautious of a person, and he will be the one whose job it is to write the actual report. And as they go around and they see all these things, and Abba Eban goes to work with him, he said, I guess as a black man, I can very much identify with the Jewish experience over here, and I'm on your side, or not exactly words to that, but almost to that effect. So history is happening in very funny kinds of ways. To make it even more of a slam dunk, the committee happens to be at Haifa visiting the day of the Exodus. Right? Let's see if we can get this up here. Next week,
The committee was still in Palestine. A ship called Exodus arrived in Haifa, loaded with Jewish Holocaust.
this is total PR.
But now she had on board some 5,000 Jews who hoped to enter Palestine illegally. When she was boarded at sea by the Navy, a fierce battle was fought on her decks, resulting in many casualties on both sides.
The UN committee saw firsthand the immigrants' despair when they were forced to return to Europe. The Jews argued that
There they are, the United Nations UNSCOP.
and that they would not be welcomed by an Arab state.
You saw those people in the white hats, all the rest of it. These were delegates picked by the United Nations, neither from America nor from Russia. They were from South America. There were some from Guatemala and Granados, from some other countries over there. They had people from India and from Iran, believe it or not, and other. I forget all the different countries that are a real international hodgepodge. They cannot help but be impressed by the difference between the warm shoulder offered them by the Jews versus the cold shoulder offered them by the Arabs. You may be sure if Abba Eban is in charge, they're going to see a kibbutz, they're going to the Weizmann Institute, they're going to see places, Ben Shemen, where they're rehabilitating kids from the Holocaust and all kind of stuff. No, so you're going to see the best possible face. The Arabs aren't cooperating. So they do visit, some Arab senators, but the Arabs basically say, we don't want to talk to you. And what are these people doing here? If you weren't here, we would kill them. This is gold for the Zionists. You see? The Arabs played the wrong card. It's as simple as that. And I'm sure if an Arab watches all this today, they probably hit themselves 10 times that, like, how could we make so much mistake? Because they're not that dumb today. Now they're quite sophisticated in PR. But they weren't, obviously, at that time. And then to make it even better, Ben-Gurion testifies in front of the UNSCOP, and he says, look here, the bottom line goes like this. An Arab minority in a Jewish state will not be killed. A Jewish minority in an Arab state will be killed. That's a fact. You know that, and I know that. This is true. It's as true today as it was then. This is a powerful argument in favor of the necessity of a Jewish state, even if there will be an Arab minority living in a Jewish state. They will not be killed. The UNSCOP then visits, after Palestine, they go to Europe. They did the other round, visited the DP camps in 1947. They meet people like this lady. Listen to this. Who is an old lady. She survived the war in Russia with her family. But then her whole family was killed by the Poles after the war in an anti-Semitic uprising. 8 children and 18 grandchildren. It's a terrible story. It's gold. I hate to say it. In other words, you want the British deport the Exodus people to Germany. The argument against sending people to Palestine, Bevan says is relocate them in Europe. Look at this. I mean, can you imagine the horror over there? There's no consolation, obviously. I mean, I'm not going to be trite about it, but it's just something to think about, that lady's experience had an important role in the creation of Israel. That doesn't justify it, but you understand what I'm saying. Finally, under all this, as 1947 proceeds, we're talking about June, July, the UNSCOP finally Ralph Bunche drafts the report to the United Nations. It was a minority and majority opinion. The majority voted in favor of partition into 2 parts. Didn't say how much, what exactly they'll get. But in principle, they're going to, it's a committee, so they're going to send an official report to the General Assembly of the United Nations recommending partition into 2 states. The Jews were ecstatic, but Abihol Silver now starts the struggle. Now comes the real fight, and now we have to get down to work. To be continued.